calm criminal.
There are stretches of the Andes where the mountains do not feel like landscape at all, but like architecture. Vast walls of stone rise through cloud and shadow, layered with jungle and moss, carved by rivers that seem less like water and more like veins running through something ancient and watchful. The air is thin, the light fractured by mist, and even now there are valleys where no road exists, and no satellite image can quite see what lies beneath the canopy. It is in these spaces, somewhere between high altitude and dense jungle, that one of the oldest and most persistent mysteries of the Spanish conquest is believed to remain untouched. A fortune in Inca gold that vanished while under Spanish demand, carried into the mountains by men who never returned. By the early 16th century, the Spanish crown had become obsessed with the Americas, not merely as territory, but as a source of wealth so vast it could alter the balance of power in Europe. Silver from Potosi and gold from New Granada began to flow across the Atlantic in quantities never before seen, financing wars, building palaces, and transforming Spain into a global empire whose reach extended across oceans. Yet even amid this extraordinary extraction, rumours persisted of treasures still hidden, still protected, still deliberately withheld by the peoples who had once ruled these lands. Among the most powerful of these rumours were those connected to the Inca Empire and to the final days of its emperor, Atahualpa. In 1532, Francisco Pizarro and his small contingent of Spanish soldiers entered the Andean highlands and arranged a meeting with Atahualpa in the city of Cajamarca. What followed is one of the most studied and brutal episodes of the conquest. Through deception and superior weaponry, the Spanish captured the emperor, killing thousands of his attendants in a matter of hours. Atahualpa, understanding both the greed and the desperation of the men who held him, proposed a ransom unprecedented in scale. He promised to fill a room with gold and 2 more with silver in exchange for his release. The room itself, according to Spanish chroniclers, measured roughly 22 feet long and 17 feet wide, and Atahualpa indicated a height he could reach with his arm raised. Everything within that volume, he said, would be filled with gold objects gathered from across the empire. Over the following months, messengers travelled throughout Inca territory carrying orders to temples, palaces, and sacred storehouses. Gold statues were dismantled, ritual vessels were packed into caravans, masks, jewellery, ceremonial knives, and sun discs that had once hung within temples dedicated to Inti, the sun god, were stripped from their sanctuaries and loaded onto litters and pack animals. Spanish witnesses later described the arrival of these objects in Cajamarca as a procession that seemed endless, a slow accumulation of wealth beyond anything Europe had seen since antiquity. Yet even as the ransom was being assembled, tensions within the Spanish camp grew. Some feared that once released, Atahualpa would rally forces against them. Others believed executing him would demonstrate Spanish dominance and eliminate any future threat. In July of 1533, despite the partial payment of the ransom, and despite ongoing deliveries of treasure still en route, Atahualpa was executed by garrote. News of his death travelled outward along the same mountain roads that had carried the gold. Somewhere along those roads, according to both Spanish and later indigenous accounts, were Inca generals and porters transporting what remained of the promised treasure, an enormous caravan of gold and silver objects that had not yet reached Cajamarca. When they learned that the emperor for whom this wealth had been gathered was already dead, they faced a decision that would shape centuries of speculation. Rather than continue toward the Spanish, they turned away. Spanish reports from the period are fragmented but consistent in one crucial detail. A significant portion of the ransom never arrived. Chroniclers writing within decades of the conquest refer to convoys that disappeared into mountainous terrain, guided by priests and nobles who knew the hidden paths of the Andes. Some suggest the treasure was diverted toward Quito. Others describe routes leading east into cloud forests, where steep valleys descend into jungle, so dense that movement even today is slow and uncertain. A few accounts mention sealed caves used by the Inca for sacred storage, places known only to specific lineages of priests who carried knowledge orally rather than in written form. Whatever the precise route, the consensus among early Spanish observers was simple and maddening. A vast quantity of gold had been deliberately removed from Spanish reach and concealed somewhere within the mountains. The geography of the region made recovery nearly impossible, even for those who knew roughly where to search. The Andes are not a single range, but a network of ridges, valleys, and plateaus stretching thousands of miles, intersected by rivers that can transform from gentle streams to violent torrents within hours. Weather changes rapidly, fog descends without warning, trails erode or vanish beneath landslides. For men accustomed to European terrain, navigation alone presented a constant risk of death. Yet the potential reward was so immense that search parties began forming almost immediately. Spanish officers petitioned the crown for permission to locate the missing ransom. Adventurers followed rumors from village to village. Indigenous guides were interrogated, bribed, or coerced into revealing what they knew. Most led nowhere. Some led into terrain from which searchers never returned. Over time, the story of the vanished Inca ransom evolved into something more complex than a simple lost convoy. It became a layered mystery involving geography, secrecy, and the possibility that the treasure had been intentionally hidden in a way designed to prevent its recovery by any outsider. Accounts began to circulate of tunnels sealed with stone, of lakes chosen precisely because of their depth and remoteness, and of ritual protections placed upon the gold by priests determined that it would never again be melted down to fund foreign wars. Whether these protections were symbolic or believed to be literal matters of spiritual defense is difficult to determine from surviving records. What is clear is that many who went searching over the centuries came to believe the treasure was not merely hidden, but guarded in ways that extended beyond physical obstacles. One of the earliest persistent theories centered on the Longanauis Mountains of what is now Ecuador, a region characterized by steep ridges, swampy high-altitude valleys, and dense cloud forest. Even today, the area remains sparsely mapped and notoriously difficult to traverse. Spanish-era references describe it as a place where paths vanish into vapor and where compasses behave unpredictably due to mineral deposits in the rock. Indigenous oral traditions from nearby communities speak of sacred storage sites used during times of crisis, locations chosen specifically because they were nearly impossible for outsiders to reach. By the late 16th century, rumours had begun to circulate that the missing ransom had been diverted into this region and concealed within caves or artificial chambers constructed for that purpose. Despite repeated attempts, no definitive recovery was ever recorded. Instead, the mystery deepened, drawing in generations of explorers who believed that somewhere beneath layers of moss, stone, and soil lay objects once handled by priests and emperors, objects whose disappearance altered not only the fate of an empire, but the economic history of the world. The gold taken during the conquest of the Americas reshaped global trade, funded European conflicts, and accelerated the rise of colonial power. Yet a portion of that wealth, perhaps a substantial portion, appears to have slipped beyond reach at the very moment it was most desired. It is this absence, more than any confirmed discovery, that has sustained fascination for nearly 5 centuries. From the beginning, there were hints that locating the treasure would require more than endurance or luck. Spanish searchers reported guides who refused to travel certain routes after sunset. Travellers spoke of valleys where sound carried strangely and where landmarks seemed to shift in fog. Whether these observations reflected genuine environmental phenomena or the psychological effects of isolation and altitude is difficult to separate from the narratives that grew around them. What matters is that by the time the further century of searching had passed, the lost Inca gold had already acquired a reputation, not merely as a hidden fortune, but as something resistant to discovery, something that seemed to evade those who pursued it too directly. Within official Spanish correspondence, references to the missing ransom continued sporadically throughout the 16th and 17th centuries. Governors wrote of planned expeditions. Missionaries reported hearing stories from remote communities. Soldiers claimed to have glimpsed worked gold in caves during patrols but were unable to relocate the sites. None of these accounts resulted in confirmed recovery. Instead, they formed a scattered archive of near misses and unfinished searches, a paper trail of frustration and speculation that extended across decades. The absence of resolution only intensified belief that the treasure existed in substantial quantity and remained hidden somewhere beyond the reach of ordinary exploration. As the centuries progressed, the story of the vanished caravan became less a single event and more a framework into which other rumours and discoveries were fitted. Any report of gold found in a remote terrain was compared against descriptions of the missing ransom. Any unexplained disappearance of a search party was folded into the broader narrative. By the 18th century, European travellers arriving in South America often carried with them not only maps and equipment, but copies of earlier chronicles describing the lost Inca wealth. Some came as scholars, others came openly as treasure hunters. Nearly all left without what they had hoped to find, yet the core elements of the story remained remarkably stable across time. An emperor captured, a ransom gathered, an execution carried out despite payment, a convoy of gold redirected into the mountains, and somewhere beyond the last confirmed sighting, a silence that has never been fully explained. It is within that silence that the mystery continues to reside, not simply as a question of location, but as a lingering possibility that vast quantities of ceremonial and imperial gold still lie where they were placed nearly 500 years ago, untouched by melting furnaces or museum display cases, resting instead beneath layers of earth and stone that have kept their secret longer than any modern nation has existed. In the years immediately following Atahualpa's death, Spanish attention shifted toward consolidating control over the territories they had claimed. Cities were established, administrative systems imposed, yet even as colonial structures formed, the absence of the remaining ransom lingered like an unfinished transaction. Officials understood that what had been lost represented not merely symbolic wealth, but a measurable, transformative fortune. Recovering it would strengthen the colonial treasury and reinforce Spanish authority. Failing to recover it left open the unsettling possibility that somewhere within lands now nominally under Spanish rule existed a hidden reserve of gold beyond imperial control. That possibility, perhaps more than greed alone, ensured that the search would continue. And so the mountains were entered again and again by men convinced that the next valley, the next cave, or the next reluctant guide might finally lead them to what had vanished in the year 1533. Some carried official commissions, others travelled quietly, funding their own expeditions and hoping to secure private fortunes. Many kept journals, fragments of which survive, describing terrain that seemed to resist mapping and routes that dissolved into uncertainty. A few claimed success in locating signs of hidden chambers or worked metal. None produced verifiable proof sufficient to end the search. Instead, they left behind accounts that would draw others into the same landscapes, following the same rumours, repeating the same pattern of anticipation and disappearance that has defined this mystery from its beginning. Somewhere in the Andes, perhaps beneath a collapsed tunnel, or at the bottom of a lake whose surface reflects only ski and cloud, there may still exist a concentration of gold gathered under imperial command and hidden in defiance of conquest. If so, it remains one of the few great fortunes of the colonial era, never conclusively recovered, a silent counterpoint to the vast quantities of precious metal that did reach Europe and reshape global history. Whether it lies intact or scattered, cursed or merely concealed by terrain, its continued absence has allowed it to occupy a peculiar place between documented history and enduring legend, a place where records and rumours overlap, and where each new generation of searchers must decide how much of what they pursue belongs to fact, and how much to the persistent human need to believe that something immense and valuable still waits to be found. In the months and years that followed the execution of Atahualpa, the Spanish found themselves in possession of extraordinary wealth, and yet haunted by the knowledge that a substantial portion of it had slipped away at the final moment. The gold that did reach Cajamarca was melted down almost immediately. Sacred objects, many centuries old and shaped with ceremonial precision, were reduced to ingots for ease of division and transport. Spanish soldiers who had never owned more than a few coins in their lives suddenly found themselves handling bars of gold, cut from ritual vessels and sun discs that had once hung within the holiest temples of the Inca world. Chroniclers recorded the distribution with bureaucratic precision, noting weights and shares as if the process were routine rather than the dismantling of an entire empire's sacred material culture. Yet amid this transformation of objects into bullion, the absence of the remaining ransom persisted as a source of unease. Several Spanish officers wrote letters to superiors describing reports from indigenous informants that large quantities of gold were still in transit at the time of Atahualpa's death. These reports described caravans consisting of hundreds of porters moving through high-altitude passes, escorted by soldiers loyal to the Inca nobility, and guided by priests familiar with remote storage sites used during times of war. When news of the emperor's execution reached them, the account said, "The caravan did not scatter but instead moved with deliberate coordination toward predetermined locations. Whether those locations were caves, lakes, or constructed vaults remains uncertain, but the implication was clear. The gold had not been lost through accident or ambush, but intentionally concealed." Early attempts to recover the missing wealth were crude and often violent. Spanish commanders ordered interrogations of local leaders, demanding information about hidden storage sites. Some indigenous guides, under pressure or in exchange for promises of leniency, agreed to lead small expeditions into mountainous terrain. Many of these journeys ended quickly due to weather, altitude sickness, or simple disorientation. Others penetrated deeper into regions where trails narrowed to precarious ledges and rivers cut through steep ravines. In a handful of cases, search parties reported finding signs that seemed to confirm the existence of hidden deposits. Worked stone near cave entrances, fragments of ceremonial metal objects partially buried in soil, or oral accounts describing priests sealing tunnels with stone and clay. None of these discoveries led to the recovery of significant treasure. Instead, they reinforced the belief that the gold existed, but had been hidden with extraordinary care. The brutality of the conquest itself added another layer to the mystery. Spanish soldiers frequently destroyed temples and sacred sites in search of precious metals, dismantling walls and altars in the hope that gold had been concealed within. Indigenous communities responded by moving remaining sacred objects into increasingly remote locations. Some were buried, others were submerged in lakes or rivers believed to possess spiritual significance. Over time, these acts of concealment became intertwined with the larger narrative of the missing ransom. It became difficult to distinguish between gold originally intended as payment for Atahualpa's release and gold hidden independently by communities seeking to protect their cultural heritage from looting. For Spanish searchers, however, the distinction mattered little. Any rumor of concealed gold was pursued with equal urgency. By the late 16th century, the search had begun to assume a more organized character. Colonial authorities authorized expeditions specifically tasked with locating the lost Inca treasure. These expeditions were often led by men who combined military experience with a degree of geographical knowledge, though even the most competent leaders found themselves challenged by terrain that resisted mapping. Journals from this period describe journeys through valleys perpetually shrouded in mist, where visibility could drop to a few yards and landmarks appeared to shift as fog thickened or thinned. Rivers described in one account as narrow and passable might be reported in another as wide and impassable, depending on seasonal changes. Paths marked on crude maps sometimes ended abruptly at landslides or dense vegetation. The cumulative effect was a landscape that seemed to defy consistent documentation. One recurring destination for these searchers was the region now known as the Llanganetes. Spanish descriptions portray it as a labyrinth of ridges and wetlands where movement is slow and orientation difficult. High altitude bogs swallow footprints within minutes. Sudden storms can obscure entire mountain slopes. In certain areas, mineral deposits in the rock interfere with magnetic compasses, producing erratic readings that can mislead even experienced navigators. Indigenous accounts from nearby communities speak of sacred sites within this region, used for the concealment of ritual objects during times of crisis. Some describe caves sealed with stone slabs and camouflaged with vegetation. Others mention lakes chosen for their depth and isolation, where offerings were made to deities associated with water and earth. Whether these sites were used to hide portions of the missing ransom remains unconfirmed, but the overlap between geography and oral tradition has kept the Llanganetes at the center of treasure speculation for centuries. As decades passed without definitive recovery, the story of the vanished gold began to attract not only official expeditions, but also independent adventurers. Some were former soldiers seeking fortune after leaving military service. Others were merchants or minor nobles hoping to secure wealth through discovery. A few were scholars intrigued by the historical implications of locating objects associated with Atahualpa's ransom. Their methods varied. Some relied heavily on indigenous guides and oral histories. Others attempted to interpret early Spanish chronicles in the hope of identifying overlooked geographical clues. Many combined both approaches, cross-referencing written accounts with local legends to construct speculative maps pointing toward possible hiding places. Disturbing details occasionally surfaced within these narratives. Several accounts describe search parties encountering abandoned camps containing equipment left behind in haste, as if their occupants had fled or vanished suddenly. In at least one case from the late 1500s, a group of explorers reportedly discovered human remains near a cave entrance, alongside tools used for excavation, suggesting that an earlier search had ended in death. Whether these deaths resulted from environmental hazards, conflict with local groups, or internal disputes among the searchers themselves is unclear. What is clear is that the pursuit of the missing treasure carried significant risk even in its earliest phases. Spanish administrators grew increasingly frustrated with the lack of results. Letters preserved in colonial archives reveal repeated requests for funding, followed by equally frequent expressions of disappointment when expeditions returned empty-handed. Some officials began to suspect that indigenous informants were deliberately providing misleading information to protect sacred sites. Others believed that the treasure had been moved repeatedly over time, transferred from one hidden location to another as Spanish presence expanded. A few concluded that the gold might have been dispersed or destroyed to prevent its capture, though this theory conflicted with persistent reports of large quantities still intact in remote regions. Amid these uncertainties, a rough catalogue of the missing objects began to emerge based on testimonies from those who had seen portions of the ransom before it disappeared. Spanish chroniclers described life-size statues of deities cast in solid gold, ceremonial masks inlaid with turquoise and shell, necklaces composed of large hammered beads, and ritual vessels used in offerings to the sun. There were reports of golden corn cobs crafted with botanical precision, intended for placement within temple gardens as symbolic offerings. Large discs representing the sun, some said to measure several feet across, had once adorned temple walls before being removed and packed for transport. Finely worked jewellery belonging to Inca nobility, including ear spools and pectoral ornaments, was also said to have been part of the convoy. The combined weight of these objects, according to contemporary estimates, amounted to several tons of precious metal, not including the silver that accompanied it. Each item carried not only material value, but cultural and spiritual significance. Many had been created for ritual use rather than trade. Their transformation into ransom represented a profound disruption of religious life within the Inca world. The possibility that such objects were now hidden rather than destroyed added a further layer of meaning to the search. For Spanish treasure hunters, they represented immense financial gain. For indigenous communities, they symbolized continuity and resistance, remnants of a world that conquest had attempted to erase, but had not entirely succeeded in obliterating. By the early 17th century, the search for the missing Inca gold had become an enduring feature of colonial life into parts of South America. New expeditions were launched whenever fresh rumours surfaced. Old maps were re-examined. Guides were recruited and questioned. Each generation inherited not only the hope of discovery, but also the accumulated frustrations of those who had searched before them. The mountains remained silent. Caves collapsed or proved empty. Lakes yielded nothing when probed with primitive diving methods, and yet the belief persisted that somewhere within this vast and difficult terrain lay a concentration of gold untouched since the moment it had been diverted from its intended destination. Over time, the narrative of the vanished ransom began to absorb elements that blurred the boundary between documented history and emerging legend. Some guides spoke of places where fog appeared suddenly and refused to lift until travellers turned back. Others described lights seen at night near certain valleys, interpreted by some as natural phenomena and by others as signs of spiritual guardianship. A handful of explorers wrote of experiencing disorientation or a sense of being watched in areas where they believed the treasure might be hidden. Whether these experiences reflected environmental stress, altitude effects, or the psychological weight of expectation is impossible to determine from surviving records. What matters is that such accounts contributed to a growing perception that the treasure was protected not only by geography, but by something less easily defined. Despite centuries of searching, no expedition during this period produced evidence sufficient to resolve the mystery. Instead, they left behind journals, rumours, and partial discoveries that hinted at proximity without providing confirmation. Each failure deepened the sense that the missing gold occupied a space just beyond reach, present enough to inspire continued pursuit, yet elusive enough to resist final discovery. It is within this pattern of repeated approach and repeated absence that the story of the lost conquistador treasure continued to evolve, drawing ever more individuals into landscapes where history and speculation merged, and where the possibility of immense wealth remained suspended between fact and enduring uncertainty. By the 18th century, the search for the missing Inca ransom had shifted from a largely official concern of colonial administrators into something closer to a quiet obsession shared by travellers, prospectors, and scholars who moved through the Andean territories, with journals in their packs and rumours in their minds. The region most frequently mentioned in connection with the vanished convoy was still the Llanatas Range, a stretch of highland wilderness where steep mountains rise into cold mist and then descend sharply into jungle valleys dense enough to swallow entire expeditions. Unlike the more travelled mining regions to the south, the Llanganates remained largely untouched by systematic colonial extraction, not because they lacked resources, but because they resisted easy access. Even experienced indigenous traders avoided certain routes except in favourable weather, and some valleys were spoken of in terms usually reserved for sacred or dangerous ground. Spanish and later Republican-era explorers described the terrain with a mixture of precision and unease. Valleys filled with peat bogs could appear firm from a distance and then collapse underfoot, swallowing animals and equipment. Moss-covered rock formations created natural mazes where orientation became uncertain within minutes. Clouds rolled through the mountains, not in gentle layers, but in thick, sudden banks that erased all visibility and left travellers navigating by memory or instinct. Streams ran clear but deceptively deep, fed by glacial melt that numbed limbs within moments of contact. In certain areas, mineral concentrations in the rock interfered with compass readings, producing slight but consequential deviations that accumulated over hours until travellers realised they were no longer where they believed themselves to be. It was within this geography that persistent stories placed the missing Inca treasure. Indigenous oral traditions collected by missionaries and travellers in the 18th and 19th centuries spoke of a deliberate concealment carried out by trusted retainers of the Inca nobility. According to these accounts, the caravan transporting the remaining ransom was redirected under orders from high-ranking priests who believed the gold must never reach Spanish hands after Atahualpa's death. The treasure, they said, was divided into sections and hidden in locations chosen for both physical security and spiritual protection. Some portions were placed within natural caves known only to specific lineages. Others were sealed within chambers constructed by stacking and mortaring stone, then covering entrances with earth and vegetation until no sign of human intervention remained. A smaller but symbolically significant portion, according to several versions of the story, was consigned to deep lakes whose surfaces revealed nothing of what lay below. From scattered testimonies and early chroniclers' notes, historians have attempted to assemble a provisional catalogue of the objects believed to have formed part of the missing ransom. While precise quantities remain impossible to confirm, the descriptions are consistent enough to provide a sense of scale. Among the most frequently mentioned items are large ceremonial sun discs, hammered from nearly pure gold and polished to mirror brightness, originally mounted on temple walls where they reflected sunlight during rituals dedicated to Inti. Some were described as spanning several feet in diameter and weighing more than a grown man could comfortably carry. There are references to life-sized statues representing deities and royal ancestors, crafted in solid gold or in gold sheathing over wooden cores, intended for display within sacred precincts rather than for transport or trade. Jewellery formed another substantial portion of the ransom. Spanish witnesses at Cajamarca recorded the arrival of necklaces composed of thick, crescent-shaped gold plates strung together with fibre cords, as well as ear spools so large and heavy they altered the shape of the earlobes of those who wore them. Pectoral ornaments worn by Inca nobility were described as layered constructions combining hammered gold sheets with inlaid stones and shell. Ceremonial knives known as tumi, with crescent blades and ornate handles, were reportedly packed in significant numbers, many bearing iconography associated with solar and agricultural cycles. There are also accounts of ritual vessels used for offerings of chicha, the fermented maize drink central to many ceremonial gatherings, some shaped as stylized animals or plants, and worked with extraordinary precision. Particularly evocative are descriptions of symbolic agricultural objects crafted entirely in gold. Chroniclers mention life-sized maize cobs formed from individually hammered kernels, arranged in temple gardens as representations of abundance and divine favour. Llamas, both small figurines and larger sculptural forms, appear frequently in the accounts, reflecting the animal's importance within Andean economic and spiritual life. Masks intended for ceremonial use, some inlaid with turquoise and mother of pearl, were said to have been removed from mummified ancestors and packed alongside other sacred items. These were not objects created for commerce or display in a secular sense. They were embedded within ritual systems and carried meanings that extended far beyond material value. Silver objects accompanied the gold in large quantities, though they have received less attention in popular retellings. Spanish records indicate that Atahualpa's ransom included rooms filled with silver vessels and ornaments collected from across the empire. Many of these items were melted down after reaching Spanish control, but those still in transit at the time of the emperor's executions likely formed part of the vanished convoy. The combined weight of gold and silver described in early accounts suggests a treasure measured not in chests, but in tons, requiring coordinated transport by hundreds of porters moving along carefully selected routes through mountainous terrain. As the catalogue of missing objects grew in detail, so too did the stories of those who sought them. By the early 19th century, the search for the lost Inca gold had become a kind of informal tradition among certain travellers passing through Ecuador and Peru. Some arrived with academic interest, hoping to verify historical accounts. Others came openly in pursuit of wealth. Many carried with them copies of earlier explorers' journals, attempting to retrace routes they described decades or even centuries before. The result was a sequence of overlapping expeditions, each building upon the fragments left by its predecessors. One of the earliest widely circulated micro-stories concerns a Spanish-born explorer who travelled into the Langanetas in the late 1700s after obtaining what he believed to be a map derived from indigenous sources. According to his surviving journal, he and a small party followed a route marked by distinctive rock formations and high-altitude wetlands. Several weeks into the journey, he recorded discovering what appeared to be worked stone partially concealed by vegetation near a cave entrance. Before excavation could begin, however, a sudden storm forced the party to retreat to lower ground. The explorer wrote of intending to return once conditions improved. He never did. His journal ends abruptly after a brief note describing increasing illness among his companions. When a later expedition attempted to locate the cave based on his descriptions, they found only collapsed rock and no trace of previous excavation. Another account from the early 1800s describes a pair of brothers from Quito who financed a private search after hearing persistent rumors from local herders about yellow stone glimpsed within a remote ravine. They travelled with several guides and sufficient provisions for a month. Weeks later, only one guide returned, claiming that heavy fog had separated him from the rest of the party near a marshy valley. He reported hearing distant shouts that faded quickly, and said he had searched for 2 days before retreating. No confirmed trace of the brothers was ever found. Their equipment and notes, if they survived at all, remained somewhere within terrain that few others were willing to search extensively. Perhaps the most unsettling of these early micro-stories involves an English naturalist travelling through the region in the mid-19th century. Initially uninterested in treasure, he became intrigued after local residents described ruins hidden within a valley rarely visited due to persistent fog. His letters home, preserved in fragments, describe a growing conviction that the ruins might be associated with concealed ceremonial objects. In his final surviving correspondence, he mentions discovering what he believed to be an artificial stone wall, partially buried beneath moss and soil. He writes of intending to clear the entrance with assistance from hired labourers. No further letters were received. Months later, a search party found an abandoned campsite and several tools, but no sign of the naturalist or his companions. The location of the wall he described was never definitively identified again. These stories circulated widely among travellers and settlers, reinforcing the perception that the search for the lost Inca gold carried risks extending beyond the ordinary hazards of exploration. Some attributed the disappearances to environmental dangers, unstable terrain, sudden weather changes, and the difficulty of navigation in fog-dense mountains. Others suggested that lingering loyalties among indigenous communities might have led to deliberate misdirection or even violence against those perceived as desecrating sacred sites. A smaller but persistent group believed that the treasure itself was protected by forces less tangible, that the priests who had hidden it had enacted rituals intended to prevent its recovery by outsiders. While such ideas cannot be substantiated through historical documentation, their presence within the narrative influenced how later searchers interpreted their own experiences in the mountains. By the close of the 19th century, the Langanates and surrounding regions had acquired a reputation not merely as locations of potential wealth, but as landscapes where expectation and uncertainty blended in ways that affected those who entered them. Travellers wrote of sudden disorientation in valleys where landmarks seemed familiar and unfamiliar at once. Some described hearing distant metallic sounds carried strangely through mist, though no source could be identified. Others reported fleeting glimpses of geometric shapes or straight lines in terrain otherwise dominated by natural forms, only to find nothing upon closer inspection. Whether these perceptions were the result of environmental conditions, fatigue, or the psychological weight of the search itself remains impossible to determine with certainty. What is clear is that by the time modern exploration methods began to emerge in the early 20th century, the story of the lost conquistador gold had already accumulated centuries of unresolved searches, partial discoveries, and disappearances that gave it a uniquely persistent hold on the imagination. Somewhere within this accumulation of accounts lies the possibility that at least one of the many searchers came close to success, perhaps within sight of objects last handled by Inca priests and porters nearly 500 years earlier. If so, whatever they saw did not lead to recovery sufficient to end the mystery. Instead, it deepened the sense that the treasure exists in a state of prolonged concealment, neither proven nor disproven, waiting within terrain that has preserved its secrecy across generations. And so the catalogue of missing objects remains not only a list of items once gathered for ransom, but a silent inventory of what may still lie beneath stone and soil: sun discs, masks, statues, and vessels untouched since the moments they were hidden, their presence inferred through fragments of testimony and the enduring absence of any definitive discovery. By the late 19th century, the search for the vanished Inca ransom had shifted from scattered individual expeditions into something approaching fixation among a particular type of traveller, educated enough to read old Spanish chronicles, wealthy enough to fund private journeys, and convinced that centuries of failure simply meant no one had yet searched with sufficient discipline. The Andes, and particularly the Langanetes region, began to attract these men with a peculiar intensity. They arrived carrying survey instruments, journals bound in leather, and copies of maps derived from fragments of earlier accounts. Some presented themselves as scientists or historians. Others made no attempt to disguise their motives. All believed, at least privately, that they might succeed where generations before them had not. One of the most frequently cited figures of this period was a prospector whose writings circulated widely among English-speaking explorers in the 1870s. He claimed to have acquired what he described as a derived map based on indigenous knowledge passed through intermediaries. The document, according to his own account, marked a route beginning in relatively accessible highlands and then turning east into a series of valleys characterized by marshy ground and irregular rock formations. He traveled with a small team, including local guides familiar with seasonal weather patterns. For weeks they moved through terrain described in his journal as resistant to memory, where landmarks appeared consistent at a distance, yet difficult to recognize upon approach. Several entries mention hearing water flowing beneath ground where no surface stream was visible, suggesting subterranean channels or flooded caverns. Midway through the expedition, the prospector recorded what he believed to be the first tangible sign of human construction beyond known routes. He described encountering a line of stones set at regular intervals along a ridge, partially covered by moss, but too uniform to be natural. Following this alignment, he and his party reportedly discovered a depression in the earth where probing with metal rods produced hollow echoes. The implication, though never stated outright in his journal, was that a chamber might lie beneath. Weather conditions deteriorated rapidly soon after. Heavy rain turned the surrounding ground into unstable mud. One of the guides suffered a severe fall. Supplies began to run low. The decision was made to retreat temporarily and return during a drier season with additional equipment. According to surviving correspondence, the prospector intended to organize a second expedition within months. He died of fever before it could be launched, leaving only his notes and a sketch map that subsequent searchers would attempt, unsuccessfully, to interpret. The late 19th and early 20th centuries saw a succession of similar ventures, each building upon fragments left by predecessors. Some were modest undertakings lasting only weeks. Others extended for months, supported by pack animals and teams of hired labourers. The tone of the journals from this period shifts noticeably from cautious optimism to something more strained. Explorers wrote of days spent navigating fog so dense that direction became guesswork, of nights punctuated by unfamiliar sounds carried across valleys where visibility dropped to nothing after sunset. Several accounts mentioned the peculiar acoustics of the region, metallic echoes that seemed to travel without clear origin, low vibrations felt through the ground, and occasional flashes of reflected light on distant slopes where no obvious reflective surface existed. One expedition from the early 1900s, funded by a consortium of investors from Guayaquil, provides a particularly detailed example of how quickly rational search could slide into confusion. The leader, an engineer with surveying experience, approached the project methodically. He divided the search area into grids, established base camps, and maintained meticulous records of daily movement. For several weeks, the expedition progressed without incident. Then, according to his surviving log, members of the party began reporting difficulty retracing routes between camps that had been visited repeatedly. Landmarks noted in previous days' entries appeared altered or absent. Paths marked with cut branches seemed to end abruptly or lead into marshy ground where no trail had existed before. The engineer attributed these discrepancies initially to fatigue and poor visibility. His tone shifts in later entries, becoming terse and increasingly uncertain. The final pages of the log describe an incident in which 2 labourers failed to return from a short reconnaissance mission. A search conducted the following morning found their equipment near a shallow ravine, but no sign of the men themselves. The expedition withdrew soon after. No trace of the missing labourers was ever documented. Not all micro-stories end in disappearance. Some conclude with psychological unravelling rather than physical loss. An American surveyor travelling through the region in 1913 left behind a journal that reads at first like a conventional travel record. Descriptions of flora, altitude measurements, and occasional references to rumours of hidden gold. As the weeks progress, the tone changes subtly. He begins to write of recurring dreams involving geometric shapes and underground chambers. Later entries describe waking disorientation, an inability to determine direction even when standing in familiar terrain. He records hearing what he interprets as distant hammering beneath the ground during the night. The final entries become fragmented, shifting between detailed sketches of rock formations and increasingly abstract reflections on the persistence of the search. The journal was found years later among his possessions after he returned home prematurely and withdrew from public life. He never spoke publicly about what he believed he had experienced. These episodes contributed to a growing perception that the pursuit of the lost Inca treasure exerted a psychological effect on those who engaged in it deeply, whether this effect resulted from environmental stress, isolation, altitude, or the cumulative weight of expectation is impossible to determine definitively. High altitude regions are known to produce symptoms ranging from mild disorientation to severe cognitive impairment in those unacclimated. Extended periods in fog-dense terrain can distort perception of distance and direction. Yet the consistency with which explorers described similar sensations, a sense of being close to discovery, of encountering subtle signs that vanished upon closer inspection, added to the aura surrounding the search. By the mid-20th century, technological advances began to alter the nature of exploration in the Andes. Aerial photography provided new perspectives on previously inaccessible terrain. Improved mapping techniques allowed for more accurate representation of topography. Yet even with these tools, the regions most frequently associated with the missing treasure remained difficult to interpret. Dense vegetation obscured ground features from above. Cloud cover limited visibility during key seasons, and the sheer scale of the mountainous landscape meant that even systematic surveys could overlook small caves, sealed tunnels, or submerged objects hidden beneath layers of sediment. Several expeditions during the 1950s and 1960s attempted to combine historical research with modern surveying methods. Researchers cross-referenced early Spanish chronicles with indigenous oral histories, attempting to identify locations mentioned in both. Some of these efforts produced intriguing results. Reports of worked stone in remote valleys, fragments of metal objects inconsistent with known colonial-era mining activity, and occasional accounts from local residents describing areas avoided for reasons not fully explained. None of these findings led to definitive recovery of the missing ransom. Instead, they reinforced the pattern that had defined the search for centuries. Proximity without confirmation, hints without resolution. The darker aspects of the narrative also persisted. Stories circulated of searchers who became reclusive after returning from unsuccessful expeditions, convinced they had overlooked something crucial. Others spent years attempting to reconstruct routes described in fragmentary journals, only to abandon the effort after repeated failure. A small number reportedly claimed to have seen objects consistent with descriptions of Inca ceremonial gold, but were unable to relocate the sites where they believed these glimpses occurred. Such claims, lacking verifiable evidence, remain part of the broader folklore surrounding the treasure rather than established historical fact. Yet their recurrence across decades has contributed to the enduring sense that the missing gold occupies a space just beyond reach, visible only in fragments and never fully revealed. Local communities living near the most frequently searched regions developed their own perspectives on the continued influx of treasure seekers. Some viewed them with quiet amusement, regarding the mountains as places where outsiders often underestimated both terrain and weather. Others treated certain valleys and lakes with a degree of caution rooted in long-standing cultural beliefs. Guides sometimes agreed to lead expeditions partway into remote areas, but refused to proceed beyond specific points, citing reasons that blended practical concern with references to places considered spiritually sensitive. Whether these refusals reflected genuine belief in protective forces or simply an understanding of the dangers involved is difficult to determine. What is clear is that even in the 20th century, the search for the lost conquista or gold remained entangled with landscapes and traditions that resisted straightforward exploration. By the time satellite imaging and digital mapping technologies became available in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the mystery had already accumulated nearly 500 years of unresolved searching. Modern tools offered new possibilities for identifying anomalies in terrain and vegetation patterns, yet they also revealed just how vast the potential hiding places remained. The Andes and adjacent cloud forests contain thousands of square miles of rugged, sparsely inhabited land. Caves collapse and reform. Rivers alter courses. Landslides bury and expose sections of ground unpredictably. Within such a dynamic environment, objects concealed centuries ago could remain hidden indefinitely, their presence detectable only through chance discovery or precise knowledge passed down through generations. And so the search continues, not as a single coordinated effort, but as a dispersed series of attempts carried out by historians, explorers, and occasional fortune seekers drawn by the same combination of documented history and enduring uncertainty that has sustained the mystery since 1533. Somewhere within the mountains, perhaps beneath a layer of stone that has not been disturbed since the moment it was placed, there may still rest the objects gathered for a ransom that was never completed. Sun discs, masks, statues, vessels, jewelry shaped by hands long turned to dust. Whether they remain intact or scattered, protected by terrain alone or by something less easily explained, they persist as one of the last great absents of the conquest era, a fortune that changed the course of history precisely because it did not arrive where it was meant to go. In the present day, the Andes no longer feel like the edge of the known world, at least not on maps. Satellite imaging has traced river systems once thought unmappable. GPS coordinates can be fixed to locations that earlier explorers could only describe through sketches and uncertain bearings. Drones can rise above forest canopy and transmit clear aerial views of valleys that would have taken weeks to reach on foot. Yet for all of this technological precision, the mystery of the vanished Inca ransom remains fundamentally unchanged. No confirmed cache of Atahualpa's missing gold has ever been recovered. No sealed chamber has been opened to reveal the object described in Spanish chronicles. The silence that began in 1533 persists, uninterrupted by proof. Modern expeditions tend to begin not in the mountains, but in archives. Researchers examine colonial records preserved in Lima, Quito, and Madrid, searching for overlooked references to routes or storage sites. Indigenous oral histories, recorded by anthropologists over the past century, are compared against these documents in an attempt to identify points of convergence. Certain locations appear repeatedly across sources. Remote valleys east of Quito, high altitude wetlands within the Llanganates, and deep lakes surrounded by terrain difficult to approach without local guidance. Each location offers possibilities and obstacles in equal measure. Dense vegetation obscures entrances to caves. Seasonal flooding alters the shape of riverbanks. Landslides triggered by heavy rainfall can bury entire sections of hillside beneath new layers of soil and rock. A handful of expeditions over the past several decades have attempted to apply non-invasive detection technologies to these regions. Ground-penetrating radar has been used in limited areas where terrain permits equipment transport. Metal detection surveys have been conducted near sites associated with historical rumours. Sonar scanning has been attempted in certain lakes believed by local tradition to contain submerged offerings. The results have been inconclusive. Radar signals are often disrupted by mineral-rich rock and uneven ground. Metal detection yields fragments consistent with colonial-era activity, but nothing approaching the scale described in accounts of the missing ransom. Lakes proved difficult to scan effectively due to depth, sediment, and underwater vegetation. Each technological attempt narrows possibilities slightly while leaving the core mystery intact. Local perspectives on the search vary. In some communities, the story of the hidden gold is treated as a distant historical curiosity, something spoken of occasionally but not regarded as immediate reality. In others it carries a more complex significance, intertwined with memories of conquest and resistance. Elders recount stories passed through generations about objects taken from temples and hidden rather than surrendered. Certain valleys and lakes are still approached with caution, not because of confirmed treasure, but because of what those places represent within cultural memory. Guides occasionally agree to lead researchers into remote areas, though boundaries remain. There are routes they will not follow and locations they will not identify, not always out of secrecy, but from a sense that some things are not meant to be disturbed. Reports of unusual experiences continue to surface, though they are typically described in measured rather than sensational terms. Modern trekkers speak of sudden fog banks that reduce visibility to almost nothing within minutes. Survey teams describe equipment malfunctioning in areas where magnetic interference is strong. A few researchers have noted moments of profound disorientation when moving through dense cloud forest, a sensation of losing spatial reference even with GPS devices in hand. Such experiences are not unique to this region. Similar conditions occur in mountainous environments worldwide. Yet within the context of a centuries-old search, they acquire additional weight. Each instance of confusion or misdirection becomes part of the ongoing narrative, reinforcing the impression that the treasure, if it exists where tradition places it, remains effectively shielded by terrain and circumstance. Occasionally, rumours surface of discoveries that promise resolution. A farmer reports finding a worked gold fragment while clearing land. A hiker claims to have glimpsed a metallic surface beneath shallow water near a remote lake. A group of amateur explorers announces plans to excavate a site identified through historical research. These reports generate brief waves of attention before fading when evidence fails to materialize. Most prove to be misinterpretations of natural mineral deposits or remnants of known colonial activity. None have produced the kind of discovery that would confirm the location of Atahualpa's missing ransom. The pattern repeats with quiet regularity, anticipation, investigation, and then a return to uncertainty. The economic value of the treasure, if found, would be immense. Even a fraction of the objects described in early accounts would represent billions in modern terms, not only as precious metal, but as irreplaceable artifacts of cultural and historical significance. Museums and governments would likely contest ownership. Questions of repatriation and heritage would arise immediately. Yet these considerations remain hypothetical because the treasure itself remains hypothetical, existing in a space defined by consistent historical reference and persistent physical absence. Its power lies not in confirmed presence, but in the sustained possibility that it might still be there, somewhere beyond the last verified search. There is a peculiar endurance to mysteries rooted in specific historical moments. The disappearance of the Inca ransom occurred at a point when written records were beginning to intersect with oral traditions, and when global awareness of the Americas was expanding rapidly. Enough documentation exists to establish that a large quantity of gold was gathered, and that not all of it reached Spanish hands. Enough time has passed without recovery to transform that absence into legend. The result is a narrative suspended between history and speculation, anchored by documented events, yet open to interpretation in ways that purely fictional stories are not. It invites each generation to reconsider the same questions with new tools and new perspectives, even as the answers remain out of reach. Somewhere in the Andes, perhaps beneath a slope that appears no different from thousands of others, there may exist a sealed chamber or a buried deposit containing objects last handled during the final days of the Inca Empire. They may lie intact, preserved by stable conditions and the absence of disturbance. They may have been scattered by landslides or submerged by shifting waterways. They may have been discovered and quietly removed at some point without entering historical record, or they may never have existed in the precise form later narratives imagined, their story shaped as much by expectation as by fact. Each possibility coexists with the others, because none can be conclusively confirmed or dismissed. What remains certain is that the gold taken during the conquest reshaped the trajectory of nations far beyond the Andes. It financed wars, influenced trade, and altered the balance of power across continents. Yet a portion of that wealth, gathered under imperial command and then diverted into mountains and jungle, seems to have stepped outside that historical flow. If it still rests where it was hidden, it has done so longer than most modern states have existed, untouched by the forces that transformed the rest of the New World's resources into instruments of empire. In that sense, the missing ransom occupies a strange position within history, a fortune defined not by its impact, but by its absence. Treasure hunters continue to arrive, though they are fewer now and often quieter in their intentions. Some come with academic credentials and research grants. Others arrive with little more than copied maps and determination. They walk the same valleys described in journals centuries old. They study rock formations and watercourses. They listen to stories told in villages where memory extends further back than written record. Most leave without finding what they sought. A few return convinced they came close. Though close in this context is a distance that cannot be measured precisely, the mountains absorb their footsteps as they have absorbed those of every searcher before them. And so the mystery remains where it has always been, somewhere between documented history and the persistent human conviction that something of immense value still waits to be uncovered. Deep in the mountains of South America, beneath mist and jungle and stone, there may lie sun discs that once reflected temple light, masks that covered the faces of priests, statues carried across high passes under imperial command. They may rest exactly where they were placed nearly 5 centuries ago, untouched by the hands that once sought to claim them, or they may exist only as the echo of a story, repeated so often it has become inseparable from the landscape itself. Either way, the search continues in quiet forms, a map studied by lamplight, a route traced across a digital screen, a journey planned with cautious optimism. Somewhere beyond the last confirmed trail, the possibility endures that the gold diverted in 1533 did not vanish entirely, but simply withdrew from history, waiting in silence beneath earth and water, its location known only to those who carried it into the mountains and to whatever remains of them now.